Hello again, Internet. It's been a hot minute, and it is a hot day. It's Bobby again with Madness Labs, just doing a little video on Cloud Functions with Firebase. So we've been using these for a while now, and just wanted to kind of make a video that outlines just kind of my general workflow. This again, just my take on it. Basically going to just kind of go over how to just the general layout of this project first off, and you can download you can clone the project. It's up on GitHub at madnesslabs/madnesslife. That's the project I'm going to be working on in this video. It is a pretty generic stencil starter, but I've added on some of my own things that I think make it really helpful, and then I've already ran the Firebase init to initialize, and I've got storage and Cloud Functions and Firestore and all that kind of stuff already installed. So check out the documentation if you don't know how to do that. But if you do have that ready and you're ready to go, what we're going to do is we're going to basically start in our front end, kind of walk over just the basic stencil, do a quick 10,000 foot view there of what we've got set up, and then we're going to actually show the back end, kind of how that is set up. And then we're going to actually write a service, and then we're going to write a test around that service to actually make sure that everything's working, and that's just kind of like how my new workflow has been here recently of just kind of writing services, testing them, and then that way we have nice tests around our functionality. And then basically once the tests are passing and everything's good, we'll then wire the service up to a Cloud Function, and then deploy that to Firebase so that we have that full circle, and then we'll utilize that via the front end, and just kind of take it from there. So let's go ahead and start by again walking through the front end. So when you pull down the project, we've got a source directory, and this is where the actual front end of the application lives. And we've got assets, which is like images, fonts, stuff like that. Then we've got components, which are the lists of the web components that our application is constructed of. Then we've got our global directory, which are like global things for the entire application, like for instance our CSS styles for like the entire application. Usually these are only for like config variables and stuff like that, like you can see here. We also have app.ts, which just again is just like the main overall like bootstrapped JavaScript functionality that runs instantly when the application is called. And then we have the environment file, and this is something, again, this is some syntactic sugar that I've added onto this to make it easy to switch between environments. So now if we look at the Madness Life app, it's really simple. This is what gets pulled in on the index. So on our index, we can see the Madness Life component, and then under our components, we have the Madness Life component. And down here, you can see in the TSX file, which this is the actual component, we can see that it's really just calling the stencil router, and then that's going to then call the app home component whenever we hit the main root URL. So that's what we have so far. And so when I first clone down the project, I want to run npm install, and then what I can do is it's automatically going to basically install the dependencies and get this whole thing running. So then I should be able to do npm start, and it'll pop open in the browser, which we will see here un momento. Booyah. Okay, so this is what we should be seeing if you just clone down the repo. And what we're going to do now is let's look at the backend. Let's look at what we're going to be dealing with there. So the backend is stored under functions. And again, once when you run your npm install in the main directory, it should automatically install the node modules directory under functions as well. If it doesn't, if you don't see the node modules directory there, just go ahead and cd into the functions directory and run npm install. And then you'll see that under the source directory here, we have __ tests, and that's where all of our tests are going to live. And then we have services, which is where all of our services will live, our backend services. And then we have triggers, and triggers are where all of our triggers are going to live, like our event triggers. So for instance, when you call an HTTP endpoint, or when the database makes a record or writes a record, or when somebody authenticates with your authentication service. So these are kind of the triggers, the event triggers that we're going to be like triggering stuff onto. And usually it's going to be pretty clean. We're going to do something very much like this where we're returning some kind of a response after we run a service from our services directory. So that's the general layout. So again, once you do the npm install and get your node modules all installed, then what you're going to do is in the root directory, and I'll just clear my consoles here. So in the root directory, what we're going to do is we're going to run npm start, and that again is going to start the front end build. So that's going to build the stencil application and then start a watcher so that it watches over it. And we are not using the stencil dev server. We're using browser sync to do ours, just because it allows it allows us to actually view the application over our local Wi-Fi, which is super useful for like mobile debugging. And then I'm going to pop open another one, and I'm going to go to I'm going to run NPM Run API. And what that's going to do is that's going to run the npm run serve command from inside the functions directory to start the backend. And this is going to emulate Firebase Cloud Functions on our local machine. However, this only will allow us to emulate HTTP functions. So it's not going to emulate somebody logging in and getting those like authentication endpoints. It's also not going to get any of the database update and delete and all that stuff. You'll actually have to deploy your functions before those ones will run. They have to be ran on a test server. And honestly, just with my new workflow I actually like that, and it's because of the fact that it makes it a little bit more inconvenient to do these things on the fly. So it becomes really useful to write tests, and it forces you to write tests because that's the easiest way to iterate over the functionality without having to like spin up the front end and do all this extra crap. So it's or deploy anything. So I actually think that as much as it seems weird when you're coming from like the PHP world where we install the examp stack on our computer, or the Java world where we install the SDK, this makes a lot of sense in a weird way, just because of the fact that you're forcing yourself to kind of write these tests and only deploying these or only getting to the point where you're testing these things in the front end whenever you're deploying them. So that being said, let's go ahead and test out some functions here. So we can see our interface, and then we can also see over here on the right that we've already got a pre-made hello world function. So we can see that function right here. So I'm going to go ahead and click it, and it's going to open it in the browser, and we can see data hello world. So it's hitting this endpoint, and it's giving me back this response. So I can use this endpoint right here in order to actually do like a RESTful API call. So that's basically like the gist. Like we're gonna make these nice endpoints, and we're gonna hand back data after we run our services. And one of the things that's a little bit different when you're coming from a traditional like RESTful API is that on a traditional server, right? Like you buy a droplet from like DigitalOcean or something, and you've got 8 gigabytes of RAM, and that's where you store your API, and all the API endpoints all live on that server. And so if you want to scale that, you have to pump more resources, you have to pump more things into that for that thing to scale. And also if you're loading it, you have to load a lot of things inside of a RESTful API in order to make sure that like everything can run. And sometimes you're loading things that aren't necessarily needed when you're running one API endpoint versus another, but just by the nature of how it works, you get a lot of extra junk that gets bundled in. So what's really kind of intuitive and interesting about the Cloud Functions is that each function itself is treated like its own server, like its own emulated little instance. And we can control the memory even on each function inside of these Cloud Functions. So that's going to make sure that this thing is modular and it scales infinitely. We're not bundling a bunch of API stuff together and a bunch of different things that we need. We're basically writing one-to-one. We're writing one piece of functionality that lives in one Cloud Function, and that will scale infinitely because they can then spin up a million, zillion, billion instances of this, and we're not sharing this pot of resources. So that being now that I've kind of explained a little bit more about it, let's actually go ahead and write a service. So services, I've got services on the front end and the back end usually. So like front end services are usually just my JavaScript-y kind of stuff that I need to tuck away somewhere. And then on the back end, I have kind of the same paradigm, just with uppercase letters, just to differentiate them as I try to autocomplete them. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and write a service here to add to-dos. So like, let's just do the standard to-do list application. Let's just walk through that process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make a new file underneath services, and I'm going to say todo.ts. And I'm going to cheater, pumpkin eater. I'm going to grab one of my other ones. I don't know why I always need this, but no, I'll do it from this guy. Okay, so super important. Make sure that you're writing these doc blocks. It's a practice that I've been like making myself do more and more as I've been developing, and it's just going to make it simpler for handoffs and for making sure that everyone's on the same page. And now for us, like, we can use them on the front end, we can use them on the back end. They're all using the same like general syntax and everything, so it makes it really easy. And you will forget what these things do. It's inevitable. Okay, so we don't have any resources on this. We just need to say a service for adding, editing, and deleting to-dos. Go to-do list. Okay, so I'm gonna make my to-do service. Cool. So now I've got a simple class, right? So I want to be able to test this class and make sure that, again, what traditionally I would do, right, is I'd spin up my web server, I'd have a web server running locally, and then I'd hook up my endpoint, and then I'd start hitting that endpoint, and that's how I would kind of test and run through the whole process. But instead, I want to just like kill that. I don't really need that at this point in time. I'm going to do npm run test API. I think it's watch. Yes, maybe. Okay, yes. So we're going to run API. It's either test API watch or API test watch. Either one works. And it's going to run all of the tests inside of this _ tests directory. And if they pass, it'll give you this nice little green check mark, and you'll be happy. But if it doesn't pass, like for instance, if I flip this to false, it will be red, and it'll tell you what it was expecting, and it'll help you kind of debug it. So this is far quicker and faster than having to spin up an API, endpoint, send stuff in, get on Postman, post things back and forth. I can iterate over this thing inside the JavaScript, see it live reload and live put out the stuff to the console, and then once I'm certain on the input and the output and everything's good, then I can then integrate that into an endpoint and then test it on the front end. So that's and again, because usually, you know, most of the time you're not the same person. Like, the same person implementing the endpoint is not always the same person that wrote the endpoint. So it's really crucial to like have these kind of things like the documentation, the tests, and all these things. And it's not just for, you know, they're not just, you know, crap that people wanted to justify their jobs with. Like, a lot of this stuff is just for cleaner handoff and transparency in the code, and also so that you can sleep at night as a developer knowing that like the stuff is working as advertised. Okay, so we've got a test, and it is not passing. So I will run over this really quickly, this test file. So this test file is pretty simple. What it does is it basically just, we import Firebase admin, we import the file system, and then we are importing this environment config. And that's something, again, that we have made that basically, you know, keeps a bunch of different config variables for our current environment. So we basically get the config variables, and then we are initializing Firebase admin. So most of our stuff, I mean, if we're going to access the database or we're going to upload to Firebase or any of that stuff, we're going to have to connect to Firebase admin with Node. And so this is pretty standard stuff. This is not like the example that they have on their website, because for some reason we were not successfully able to get the storage bucket to work without actually passing in our credentials this way. So it was a good gotcha that we found. So if you're having problems uploading to Google Cloud via Node, then like this might be the ticket for you. Okay, so then down here we get into the actual tests, and this is going to describe Madness Labs, which in this case is just some sample tests that I copied over from another project. And then I set a timeout of 30 seconds. I just wanted to make sure that we wouldn't run out of time on these tests, because unlike a lot of unit tests that try to fake data and mock things, the tests that I generally write, like I don't want to mock. I want it to actually legitimately be doing the thing that it should be doing. And if it errors out and there is something like wrong with the service, and this thing doesn't pass, then that's good to know. So like I'm not a huge fan of like mocking my data. I'd rather have something that actually tests it, that tests the services that we're using. That to me is like imperative. And the amount of work that goes into mocking these things really just makes for bad tests at the end of the day. So anyway, so now we see that we're describing something, and these just give us these general categories here, these groupings of our different tests. And then we have the actual test itself. So it should do something. So basically the first argument in these tests is like a string, and it says what this piece of code should do. So in this case, let's like our service just needs to be loaded. So let's say it should load. And I'm gonna actually change the name of this because we're gonna be testing the to-do service. So we are describing the to-do service, and we are going to expect, and you can see here inside of inside of the test, we basically can do things. We can run any kind of JavaScript like we would inside of our endpoints or anywhere. And then basically all we need to do to like validate the test or to run the test is to use this expect method, and we need to say expect something, some kind of variable or some kind of method or whatever. At the end of the day, it just says return something. Expect that thing to be something. So in this case, it's to be truthy. There's also to be falsy. There's a bunch of different things, and luckily, since we're using TypeScript, you can use your autocomplete. And you'll get all of that awesome sauceness. So let's just stick with to be truthy. Just what I use most. So our service in this case should load. So let's go ahead and import our service. So up here at the top, we're going to say import to do service. Actually, I'm going to put this up to the side here. Cool. So let's import our to-do service from /services/to-do. And now what we're going to do is we are going to call that service down here. So we can say const to-do equals new to-do service, and now we can expect to do to be truthy. So now we can see our test passed. So it did, whenever you instantiate or start a class, it will return some kind of truthy value. So this test will pass. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this guy, and we're going to actually call it what it is. It is the to-do spec. Okay, so now let's get into some more of the nitty-gritty, right? Let's go ahead and make something that will allow us to add to our database. So what we're going to do, first off, I'm going to open up my Firebase console just so that we can get eyes on it, and I'm going to click into database. And I've already set up Firestore. So we've got an empty database here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write another test first. I'm going to say it should add a to-do. and we're going to say const to do. And really, since we're doing this to do all the time, since this is a to do service, we can actually just define that right up here. We don't have to do that every single time. Okay, so now we can say expect to do dot add to be truthy. So now this is going to run an add method that we have yet to make, and it's going to expect it to be truthy. And when we're adding it, we want to pass in like the actual to do, right? So that's like what the task. So I want to be like buy milk, almond milk. Okay, so I want to add a task. This is buy almond milk. And let's just keep it that simple. So I should expect that to be truthy. And just for cleanliness here, let's just say const new to do or task equals to do add. And we'll say expect the task to be truthy. Okay, so now when I save this, it's going to error out, obviously, because that doesn't exist. So now I can go about writing the functionality that I need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I need to do my add method, right? Add, and that's going to return true. So let's just do something like that. Cool, we get 2 pass tests. It's going to pass the tests because technically that is right. We can see here my compiler is screaming at me because it doesn't like that we don't have typings. So let's say payload. And payload is going to have a task, and the task is going to be a string. Booyah. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to actually hook up to the database. So let's go ahead and wire up to Firestore, and luckily we've got a database service that is just ready to go. So we can just implement this guy and talk to the database. And some of you might be thinking like, why, if we're going to work with Firestore, why do we have this, and why are we using a database service? And my general principle is to wrap services. It's called contracts. That's the I guess technical term, what most people are calling them. They're contracts. Basically, it's just a service that wraps around another service that you can always expect to work the same way. So whether we're using Firestore or Mongo, I'm going to call my database service and I'm going to say all, and I'm expect to get all of the records from a collection. So that way, if we decide to change somewhere down the road, we're not stuck. We don't have to go through all of our code and refactor and change all of these Firebase things to something else completely. We now have something that we've wrapped around the service to stay consistent. And that's going to make our lives easier and save us from problems we might run into in the future. So cool. So I'm going to go ahead and use that guy. So up here at the top, I'm going to import database service from database. And then what we're going to do is we're going to define a new thing here called DB, a new object on our, it's going to be private, a new key on our property on our class called DB, and it's going to be an instance of the database service. And then in our constructor, or actually just since we're going to be initializing this in our constructor, we can save ourselves a step by just doing it right here. Booyah. Okay, so now our database service is going to auto initialize it's going to be saved to a key called DB, and then now that will let us play around with our database service. So here's the next thing we're going to run into. Technically we're going to be talking to the database, and we're going to have to wait for them to return to us some kind of response. So because of that, we're going to need to actually use async await. So if you've never used promises before, this is going to be it's going to be completely different. but it's basically the next evolution of promises. So if you've never used promises, which you probably have at this point if you've written JavaScript, or if you're at this video, you probably have come across them. But basically, anytime you see like something like this.db.add and then .then, so this method, this add method, this returns a promise, and we can see this if we highlight over with our mouse here. We can see that it returns a promise, and then that promise has some information inside of it. In this case, an ID. So so this promise is resolved or rejected, and that's how promises work. So it's either like, hey, I did it, or I couldn't do it. And so that's then is when I could do it, and .catch is when I couldn't do it and there was an error. So when you get into bigger applications, you can imagine that if I wanted to add to the database, then upload a picture, then tie that back to their user profile, then add a to-do for them. If I wanted to do all those things, I'd end up with all of this nesting, and it would be very dirty, and you get into what's called callback hell. So to alleviate that, what's been created is async await, and async await is really, really simple. It's just basically some little extra kind of decorator type things or types that you add to your methods, and it will actually allow you to kind of run something asynchronously. So that makes JavaScript and Node very, very unique, because you can run stuff that won't wait for something to finish and will run it in the background, but then also will stop at certain points in the code and wait. So this is really, really neat, and it's really easy to use. So instead of doing .then after this db.add, what we can do is just say async to let it know that this is an async function or method. And then here I can say await this db add, and that's going to automatically pass back whatever is inside of this promise. So in this case, I'm going to get back my ID or my object with a key of our property of ID. So let's go ahead and say const task equals await this db add, and then we'll go ahead and just pass in the payload. Let's just pass that straight in, and then we're going to return task. And let's add a little enter between there. And we actually need 2 arguments in our thing. Thank you, typings. So we need to tell it where we want it to add this. So in this case, we want it under to-dos. So under our to-dos, we're going to add in whatever we have coming in from our test, or from our add method as the payload. So let's go ahead and try that out. So it looks like it says to tested pass. So I'm going to refresh my browser over here, and we're probably going to see, no, it didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work is because even though we are technically async awaiting over here, we need to do that same thing inside of our tests. Luckily, we can do that. So as you can see here, the should load function has this async keyword put before the function. So I can do that same thing down here and say async. And then now this guy, when it adds the task, right, this automatically, whenever you make something async, it automatically is going to return a promise. So if you return, no matter what you return, in this case, we're returning an object that has a key of ID, right? See, there it is. We're returning that, but it wraps that, when it compiles it, around it wraps that with a promise. So in this case, we need to do that same thing. So we make this async, and then here we can await our to-do to be added. And now when we run this test, see how it took another second there. It took a little bit longer. That's because this time it didn't just go and run straight through the test. It actually waited for the database add command to be fired. And now we should see over here, to-dos, come on, to-dos. All right, let me make sure I'm hooked up to the right database. That'd be good too. I am not. Okay, so I'm not hooked up to the right database right this second, so let me remedy that really quick. I'm going to go into my project settings. I'm going to go into service accounts. I'm going to generate a new key. And then I'm going to go ahead and open this guy up and paste that over my other one. Okay, so that's why it wasn't working. Okay, so we should be good now if we go back to the database. Insufficient permissions. Okay, cool. That's what we want to see. Maybe. Documents, read and write. Cool, we're good. All right, I'm going to kill this out and restart my build. Restart my tests. Oops, that's not right. Madness life. One more time. Let's try it again. So that environment file that gets pulled in on your local machine, it uses the package.json for the backend. It uses the package.json to load in your environment config stuff, and then it uses Firebase config for all of the actual servers that it runs on. So just a quick tip. Okay, so we're good there. So we're still, our test is still failing. Oh, no, there it goes. So now when we refresh, yeah, okay. So now again, we're writing, like, this is so much cleaner than having to like hook up an API endpoint, hook up a bunch of stuff. And as a bonus, I now have a test that that is written around this service, around this little tiny piece. So I probably want to document this a little bit more so that we know what the heck's going on here. So I might want to make like an interface, or in this case, I'm going to just put some doc blocks here and tell it what these things are. So the payload is the list object of to-do data, and this adds a to-do to your to-do list. Cool, so now we've got a well-documented, tested function that is running. So now let's go ahead and see if we can see, boom, it is working. So now let's go ahead and hook this up to our service, or to our endpoint, so, right? Now we've written a test, we know it's working. I'm gonna kill my test here. So we know it's working. Let's go ahead and get this actually hooked up to a trigger. So let's go ahead and down here, I'm gonna copy this guy. I'm going to rename him to add task. Or no, I'm going to do add to do. I lied again. To do add. Okay, to do add. And this is going to be on request of that right there, on to do add. And what we're going to do is we're going to give back the response. Let's just make sure this works first. So I'm going to go ahead and run my NPM Run API. And that's going to, again, start up a local Firebase server that's going to allow us to test our HTTP endpoints. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into our index now, and now we need to like implement that trigger. So to do that, all we got to do is import star as trigger to do add from triggers to do add. Oops, import. Okay, there we go. So now what we're gonna do is down here, export const to do add equals trigger to do add dot listener. Cool. Now we've got our endpoint hooked up. So now if everything went well, we should be able to go to this same endpoint except do to do add, and it'll give us the same response. And it did not. And why didn't it? Okay, let's figure it out. That's because I ran the wrong thing. NPM Run API. There we go. Okay, so now you can see I'm getting back my response. But again, I want this to run whenever I like post to it, right? I want to post my task, and then I want it to give me back that response. So to do that, I'm going to need to jump into on request. Yeah. To do that, I'm going to need to jump into Postman. So let's pop open Postman real quick. And you could, in theory, just test this part locally via the interface if you wanted to at this point. I just really like Postman. It's just super clean and simple. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this endpoint, and we're going to paste that. And we don't need any authorization stuff. So we can put our content type JSON back on here. Cool. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add some body to this guy, because he's going to be a post, right? We want to post, whenever they post to this endpoint, we want it to go about running this thing. So let's go ahead and do that, and then let's go and send a post in. Cool. We're getting back the response just like we did in the browser. So let's go ahead and import our service. So now we can import to-do service from services to do. Cool. And let's go ahead and down here, what we're going to do is we are going to run a response with, first off, let's go ahead and initiate our to-do service. So let's say const to-do equals new to-do service. And now we can say await to-do dot add, and then let's put something different. So we're going to be adding task, and the task is going to be buy eggs. Cool. So now we have very simple. We just imported the to-do service, and then we're going to instantiate the to-do service, and then we're going to call the add method that we made. In this case, we're just going to pass in something that we're hard coding by egg. So now when I save this, it's going to compile, and we look like we're good to go. So I should be able to click send now, and then it's going to give me back the ID. Boom, there's the ID in Firebase that corresponds with that record. Because remember, when I run async, or when I'm using async await, it's going to hand me back the data that's coming back from the promise, from the then. So in this case, it's giving us back that ID because I'm passing it through all the way to here. So cool. There we go. We've got our ID, and we can correspond that with the ID that we can see over here in the database by eggs. Booyah. So let's actually hook this up to some data that we're going to feed in, right? So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to come in here to body, and we're going to send in some raw JSON, and you'll want to have it set to JSON application JSON, and we're going to pass in some JSON here, and we're going to say task. Let's see. Oh yeah, I like coffee a lot. Okay. I usually put like we and woo. Like I've made a lot of people like, why did my code say we? And I'm like, oh, sorry, I was working on it. Okay, so coffee is what we're going to add here. So our task is coffee. So let's go ahead and over here, what we're going to have to do to pick up on that is use this request property here. So our param here. So we can do say request.params request.body.task. And actually what we're going to do, this JSON response, so even though this is going to come through as raw JSON, it's not going to be parsed. It's going to be a lump of text, I'm fairly certain. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const body equals request body, and then we're going to do a check here. We're going to say request body. So let's say type of request body equals string. Then we're going to say request or json.parse request.body, or we're going to just use the request.body. So what that's going to do is just say like, hey, body is going to be the body of the request, but if it's a string, it's probably like a lump of JSON text that needs to be seen as like an object. So we're going to parse that as an object, and then otherwise it's probably already an object, so let's just leave it the way it is. And then down here now we can say body.task. And if I wanted to get really, like, I probably should do ternary or a null check here too, body.task or null, or even better, probably do like if I get my body, and then say like if if body.task, or if no body.task, we can throw a new error. Task required to add to do. So you can do something like that, where like if they don't pass in the task, it'll scream at them. So let's go ahead and try that guy out and see what happens. So we won't send any requests through. Let's just send it. And now we do indeed. So you can see there, it did just completely crap out. A probably better way to do this would be to do, instead of throwing an error, would probably be to do like a response dot it's like end dot end. Can't remember exactly how. I think I'll have to look up in the documentation again, but basically we can send back, I mean, sometimes, a lot of times I just like give back a success, but then I just give back the error inside of a success. It really just kind of depends on how you want to do it. You can also just send back like a generic error code if you wanted, and just like a flat piece of text like this. But anywho, that's the general principle. So in this case, I'm gonna just leave it as it is. I'm gonna put back my data here, and let's make sure that we can actually send through, post, and have it add something to our to-do list. So I just ran my thing, boom, I got an ID, Y, blah, 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 and I see coffee. So now I have something hooked up so that I can actually send through the data, it adds it into the database, and then gives me back a response with the ID, super cool. So now let's go ahead and hook this guy up to the interface so that we can actually see that part in action. So now we're kind of done in the database. I'm gonna go ahead and commit this stuff up. Write tests for to-do service, add to-do method. Cool, so now we've got that. Let's go ahead and head into the source directory under the root. And in our source directory, let's go into our home page. And first off, we're gonna need a field, right? We're gonna need a field first in order to actually put this stuff in. And I'm using the Ionic core library. I'm using it via script tag. I'm not using it actually compiled in as most of the other projects that we've worked on have, just because it doesn't allow pre-rendering right now. There's a bug with it. They're working on it. So like that will be the preferred method, but I am using it just via script tag at the moment. So what we're gonna do is let's make like an ion card. Oops. Ion card. And inside of here, let's just like make an ion input. Awesome. And let's actually put this inside of a form. So form, and we don't need an action. Cool. So now we got a form with an input, and let's actually add an ion button. Submit. And let's just say save, add. Okay, so we've got an input, Okay, so we've got our on input, and we've got a button, and we've got it all in a form card. Let's just see how that looks. Cool. All right, let's add a placeholder. Awesome. So now we've got a form we can click, and it refreshed itself. So let's go ahead and use the power of Stencil's awesomeness to wire up our OnSubmit event for our form. So we're going to say OnSubmit, standard JavaScripty stuff here, and we're going to pass in a fat arrow self-binding function, and we're going to say event, and we're going to say this dot add to do, and our add to do is going to pass through the event. So now what we can say is add to do to make that method. And again, let's add our doc blocks here. Adds a to-do list item with the API. So here's the weird thing about Firebase, or Firestore in general. So in general, like I would really like right now, I would write a service first off on the front end around to-dos to operate as like a back and forth between the other to-do service. So it'd have like a one-to-one method kind of thing. But then also another thing is like I wouldn't write, if this were just the case right here, this is Firestore. If I'm just writing to the database, I would use just the client-side API because they're gonna feed that event through as fast as possible. We're not gonna have to hit the API endpoint and then that's gonna hit the database. It's gonna feed it straight through in a very efficient manner. They've done a great job with Firestore on that front. However, in this case, like I might add a to-do and then want to have it do things. And I actually, again, there's probably even there is a better way to do even that. So it just depends on your use cases. But again, this is if we need an API endpoint. So I need something that's gonna like send off something to an HTTP endpoint, and this is gonna run. Again, I'll probably have to make some more videos on like triggering stuff off of database actions and stuff like that. And that's probably even preferable for a lot of stuff like this. Like if I add a to-do list item, I could have it run the functions in the background that send emails or that do anything like that. I just need to be able to add that quickly to the database, and then the database can trigger something off of that. Okay, anyway, back to live action here. Let's get this thing hooked up. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pass through this event. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say event.prevent default. And if we want our autocomplete here, what we can do is we can say UI event and then pass in UI event here. And now we'll get our autocomplete. Note that's not a full encompassing typings. Like it can, like certain typings are not 100% like there. Like there's some stuff that'll be missing, but that's how we can get some good autocomplete. Okay, so there we go. We've got our event. We're preventing the default. So now when we submit, we should see it doesn't refresh anymore. Give it a second. Okay, so now you can see it is not refreshing anymore. Now let's go ahead and get our input element. And so what we're going to do is you can see up here we have this element. This is referencing the current element. So it's going to reference like the element that we're inside right now, this app home. But what I can do is I can then use that to like select something inside of it. So it kind of gives us some context here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const task input L is going to be equal to HTML, it's going to be equal to, input element, HTML input element. And we're going to say this dot app home element dot query selector. And we're going to select the thing with the ID of task input. And we're going to select the input inside of that element. So ion input is just a simple wrapper around an input element. So what I'm doing is I'm basically saying, okay, I want to grab the ion input and then the input inside of there. Cool. So now what I can do is I should be able to, like, let's console log our task input L value. So now if everything went well, I should be able to inspect the element over here, type in my to-do, and then I see it in the console. Cool. So I need to now make an API call. So I can actually use the database. So if you looked in the madnesslife.tsx, or actually what I want to do here is probably pass through the database service and instantiate that like right off the bat, because I'm going to be using that throughout this application. So I'm going to go ahead here at the top. I'm going to import database service from oh my god, it is so hot in here, you have no idea. Okay, so I've got my database service, and now I'm going to say db is going to be database service, and it's going to be equal to new database service, and now our database service is started. Okay, cool. So same general thing we've got, and note this is a slightly different implementation. This is the front end database service. I accidentally keep making this thing with a capital, and it's not supposed to have a capital. Okay, so they're almost interchangeable, and I would see, I would definitely see there being a time here in the very short future where like services are just all npm installed, and they're not really necessarily like something that you'd have maybe on the front end, or I don't know, talking up my butt. Okay, so what I want to do now is let's go ahead and pass through this guy, this database service that we initiated. So we can do component props with the stencil router or the ion router, or you can just pass it as a prop to any component, right? So we can say component props, and then we can say db, and actually let's do this. Let's create a new state item. No, never mind, I lied. So let's just say db, and db is going to equal this db. And I need to pass in 2 sets of curlies there. Okay, and I lied. I'm going to take this out, and I'm going to call it default props. Yeah, default props, and it's going to be an array, or an object. It's going to have db, and it's also going to be the database service. And then our component will load. I'm going to move all this stuff in here. I'm going to say db this.db equals, and actually we don't really even need to instantiate it that way. Let's just do it like this. Let's just say this.default props equals an object, and the object is going to have db equal to new database service. So that's probably the best way to do it. And then we'll say this.default props. So we're going to pass through these default props, which is just the database service. So I'm going to pass through that database service to that route, and now I can access that as a prop over here. So now I can put prop at the top, and then prop db, and then I'm going to import the database service just to get the typings, because why not, right? So now what I can do is say this.db.call. So this call service is special. So this is something that basically calls one of our Firebase functions without us having to do like an API request. This will allow us to call our actual our method. So let's go ahead and test this out. So let's go ahead and say await, because we can use this async await here as well. So let's say await, and we're going to await this.db call, and we're going to call the add, or to do add, right? We're going to call that trigger, and then the next thing we need to pass in is the data. So we have the task, and the task is going to be the task input element value. And if everything went well, let's go ahead and get the data from this. Const task equals, let's go ahead and console log the task. Okay, it's giving me some generic error. It happens. Compilers be compilers. Okay, so now I add the to-do. Okay, so I got an error, and I think I can see it right here. Task required. Yep, see task required to do. So it didn't work, and the reason why it didn't work. It's giving us a 302 error. What does that guy mean? All right, I lied. We're gonna use an API service instead. Yeah, we're gonna use an API service instead. This is another way to do it. I think you have to wire it up slightly differently, which is maybe why it's airing out. Well, let's try to fix it real quick. I think I know what it is. So I think the difference here is that body, in this case, like let's console log to see if I'm right. Console log request.body. So I think body in this case, yeah, just give me a complete internal error. Okay, well, screw it. So we won't screw with that. What we'll do instead is let's go ahead and get an API. Let's get an API service. So I'm gonna rip this off of another project. One second here. So let's go ahead and okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and make a new service on my front end. And again, this will all be on the GitHub repo, so feel free to pull this guy down. This is not what I'm looking for. Okay, so I'm gonna go into my services directory, make a new file, I'm gonna call this API, and I've got another service that I wrote here that just kind of makes it real easy to wrap around an API. So that should make things a lot easier. Okay, so now all we gotta do is pass in our host, and then we can make like get, post, and delete requests really, really easily. So let's go ahead and do that. So to do this, we need to go back into our app home, and I'm gonna do the same thing again, or not app home, Madness Live. So I'm gonna do the same thing again. I'm gonna add API, and it's gonna be an instance of the API service, and then we're going to see it automatically imported. Cool. So now we're gonna do API, new API service, and then we need to pass through some options, and we're gonna have a host, and the host, we actually have, again, we have an environment that we can use here. So let's use our environment config and get the host. So inside of our engine.local.ts, we can see here that we have our Madness Life. And actually, let's get rid of this guy. Yeah. Okay. So in here we have app API URL. So that gives us our API URL for our local machine. So what I can do here is I want to pass that through as the host. So to get that, I need to actually import our environment so I can get those variables. So I'm going to go ahead and import get config, I think, from services slash no, sorry, not a slash, global environment. I think that's it. Let me cheat again. Oh my god, I'm like freaking dying in here. This is so hot. Okay, it's config services. Services, import config service. I lied. Okay, I imported the wrong thing. I made another wrapper around that wrapper to wrap my wrappers. Okay, so what we can do now is we should be able to say const config equals new config service, and then we should say config dot get. I think that's all we need, right? Let's check. Get name string. Okay, so yeah, it's really, really simple. So we're gonna get our app config. So app config is gonna be our, again, if you look under your engine.local.ts, you can see there's app. So I'm getting that config. And so now I can go ahead and say app config.host. I think is what it's called. No, sorry, API URL. Whew. Okay. So now we've got our API service being passed in as a default prop, and it's automatically connecting with our environment's API URL. So we're set up there. Cool. Let's go ahead and save that. And then now back in our app home, again, we can do that same thing. I'm going to get rid of, well, I'm going to leave the DB service because we're going to need that as well. But again, let's get back to trying to get this thing firing an API endpoint. So API is going to be equal API service. Thank you for automatically importing that. Cool. So now we're going to do API post. And we're going to post to do add. And we're going to pass that through. Okay, so that should be it. That I would hope is what we need. So what's cool is because we've sent in our, when we instantiated our API service, because we passed in the link or the URL or whatever, the host, it automatically does that. So all we got to do is call the endpoint, and it'll fill in the rest. So it's just a really, again, just a really clean wrapper around an XML HTTP request. So here we go. We're gonna add. Okay. Does not no access. Okay, so we've got a no access origin allowed, and I think we have our cores on here. So I would say I'm gonna call bullshit on this. Let's see. Let me do some checking here. Make sure authentications. So yeah, we're set up on localhost. What's the dealio? Oh, it's going to API again. What the frick? Hold please, technical difficulties. Oh, I think it's because we need to rebuild. Yeah, we do. Okay, so now that we change that, when you change config variables, you got to restart the build. I should have known. I should have known. Okay, I think this long video is about to come to a close. My goodness. Oh god, now I'm getting a random error. Joy. Okay. So again, if this is just a Firebase thing, I would access Firestore directly on the front end. Let's see. How is it unresolved? You know you exist. Oh, that's why. D. Okay. Try this one more time. Whew. My brain is frying in my head like an egg. Okay. Let's do this. All right, so I'm gonna inspect here, and hopefully this time I type in something, I click add, it goes out to the API. Boom, comes back with my response. That's right, mother. Okay, so we should be good there. We are responding uncaught in promise though. Yeah, it came back 100% right. So I think it's just a problem with it being running this async. Almost betting. So I'm going to turn this back to a regular one, and we'll say dot then task catch error and we'll console log our error, and we'll console log our task. Cool, so now we should have the same thing. And we can see that guy if we go back to our database. Okay, cool, so we can see it. Yeah, we can see it. Let's go ahead and add another one just to make sure. Okay, yeah, now we're running fine. It didn't like us passing back a promise on this OnSubmit, which is fine. So, cool. So now we've got the to-dos adding via the API. And again, this is probably not how I do it. I would probably access db.add and add it from my front end, and that would be really speedy, going directly into Firestore and then running some kind of watcher on when a to-do is added or something. So next what we're going to do is we're going to actually like let's list these guys out on the page. So I'm going to make another ion card here, and this will probably be the last thing. So let's do ion card, and we're going to have an ion list. And ion item. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a map. So we're going to say this dot to-dos dot map, and we're going to map over them. And what map does is it's just like a for loop, but it just maps over an array. And then each one of these is going to be a to-do. And then what we're going to do is in a JSX, we're actually like rendering, we're inside of a return. So we can do this fat arrow without the curlies, and whatever is inside of there after the fat arrow is automatically returned. So in this case, since we're returning, it's going to return this stuff. And so this is an easy way for us to like do a loop. This is like an ng for or some kind of loop, if you're familiar with this kind of stuff. Except we're using regular JavaScript here, so it's a lot cleaner and it makes a lot more sense. You're not learning, that's the beauty of Stencil, you're not learning a framework, you're learning JavaScript. You're utilizing JavaScript and the good parts of JavaScript. So, okay, so to-dos.map, and for each to-do, we just want to put on the screen to-do.task. And it should literally be that simple. So to-dos doesn't exist, right? So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to have our list of to-dos, and we're going to want to get that from Firestore, and that's where we're going to use that database service. So first, though, let's go ahead and add state. And state is basically to-dos. It's going to be a list, and each one is going to have a task, and it's going to be a string. Cool. And let's go ahead and set it equal to an empty right off the bat. Cool. So state is what causes this thing to render. So it'll fire a render every time state is updated. So this is a way to hold exactly what it sounds like, hold the state of the actual current component. So what we can do here is when the component loads, we want it to go out and get the data, the to-dos, and save it to the state. So we can use one of the events that comes with Stencil. Component did load. And this is when the component's finished loading, it's rendered and it's on the screen. And we want to wait for the component to be fully rendered so that we can serve up an empty component, then we can load the data and pop it in there. It's gonna make the users much happier. Okay, so now we can say this.db.all. I'm gonna call all, and this is gonna give us back, again, this is a nice little method that we've written that hands back a list. So for a collection, an array for a collection. So now we can say this db all to-dos, and we're going to then say, okay, this is going to be our to-dos. So we can say this dot to-dos equals to-dos. Oh, sorry. Dot then, yeah, there we go. Dot then to-dos, this to-dos. And then let's do our catch. Let's make sure that we're catching our errors. And we're saying error. You might be notice I'm not using parens around my arguments. If there's one argument inside of a method, then you can just exclude those parens. It makes it just a tad bit cleaner. So let's console log our error if we have one. Cool. And note also, I don't use console.error. And the reason why I don't use console.error is because console error will actually throw an error and stop execution. So if this isn't successful, I don't want it to kill the execution of the entire thing. So that's another good gotcha to know. Okay, so now we should, if everything went right, should see a list of to-dos. So to-do map is not a function. So in this case, map is not a function because even though I've set it up here, it's not technically set. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here and just do a ternary check. So let's say this dot to-dos question mark, we'll do that. Otherwise, null, do nothing. Cool. So now, okay, this to-dos.map is not a function. So let's console log what we're getting back from our db component did load. Let's see what we're getting back here. To-dos. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so we can see we are getting them back. However, it looks like they're an object and they're not an array. So it must be that I am using the wrong method. So let's check out my database service again. Oh, I think it's actually list, not all. So I can say list. There we go. Okay, so list the to-dos. That's going to do it. There's my to-dos. All right, so now as I add, okay, so see, and this is another. So like now I've posted my thing via the API. It's added to the Firebase, but I'm not seeing it in my list here, right? And that's because I actually want to watch my to-dos. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do watch. Well, we can watch a document. We don't really watch. We don't have a watcher for list to-dos. So let's just do this. Let's take this guy out, and let's say get to-dos, and we're gonna run the get to-dos function, and it's going to then return this. So let's just do this async, and we will just return this .db. Well, let's just leave it like it is. Get to-dos. So on component download, we want to do get to-dos, and also whenever they successfully add a new task, we will get to-dos. So let's just make it simple. So let's get rid of that and get rid of this, and I think we're at a nice stopping point. So cool. So now what we should have is we should have a field. We have to-dos up here. Come on, Chimona. Task. Oh. Task is not used. Let's just pass an empty then. Cool. So now I should be able to add. Oh, why you no get new ones? Oh, this is a good gotcha, maybe? Let's see this. Let me make sure it's saved. Oh no. Okay, so it is adding, but it's not going and getting. Then post, then does that get to-dos? Oh my goodness. I'm dying in here. I'm dying. Alright, I'm not 100% sure why it's not getting the to-dos. When in doubt, console log it out. Okay, so it only ran once. It didn't run when it's done getting the list of to-dos. When it's done posting, it looks like, actually. Where is this guy coming from? Ah, that's actually coming from an error. So for some reason, it's giving us back an error response. Okay, so I think this is probably something in my service, but we can see there's the let's look at the network real quick. And it handed me back at 200. So, oh, I think it's because I kind of enforce a structure. That's exactly what's happening. I enforce a structure in my APIs generally. That I pass back a success flag. So I probably need to go in here to my to-do add, and when it responds back, I need to do a wait to-do add, and then I also need to do comma success is true. So I bet you that's the issue, if I had to guess. Okay, so if everything went well. What's my response look like? Success is true. Take a look at my API, make sure I'm not dumb. Yeah, I need data too. So actually I want to do this. Let's do data is going to equal await. There we go. Okay, so our data and our success. Okay, so this is generally how I try to structure API endpoints. It's always going to hand back data, which is going to be some kind of lump, some kind of object or array, and then it's going to hand back a success of true or false. Again, this is all user preference. But now we should be able to see that when I add one, I add, and then now it gives me back, no, get ID token of null. What is that? Let's go ahead and take out some of that. Yeah, let's do that. That sounds good. Okay, so that's just some security stuff that I have from where I pasted this from. Okay. One more time, guys. One more time. Add. Boom. Nachos. add. So what you may have noticed is that Firebase doesn't keep things in order. This is just how they do things. They don't keep an index. They don't keep it ordered. That's up to you, and that is a topic for another time. I will commit this stuff up. Finish to do add and list. So there you go. There you guys go. I'll probably cut this up a little bit, and try to make this into maybe a cast or a couple. But here it is in raw right now. Sorry we haven't been online as much, but hopefully here in the next couple weeks things simmer down a little bit, and we'll be back to producing videos again. Thanks for everything, guys, and we'll catch you next time.